I was at the company's couples dinner, an annual event where everyone arrived arm in arm, smiling, exchanging forced compliments, and toasting small victories. I was prepared for that evening, certain it would be just another tedious formality. But nothing prepared me for the scene I found when I arrived at the dining room. Amidst the hum of conversation and the muffled sound of silverware, my eyes were drawn to a table in the back. There she was, smiling. And beside her, the man I'd already suspected existed, but who, until that moment, I'd refused to believe was real. He sat as if he owned the place, as if he owned her. My body froze. My breathing grew heavy, and for a moment, the rest of the world disappeared. It was just me, her, and that gaze that now seemed like a stranger's. I don't remember thinking much before walking over there. The footsteps sounded firm, but inside, I was shattered. When I stopped in front of her, I saw a mixture of surprise and discomfort in her eyes. She tried to hide it, but there was a trace of panic. I didn't shout, I didn't make a scene. I just said, in a low but firm voice, that it was good to know she already had a dinner date, that I was leaving and that she didn't need to worry about me, because I wouldn't be in our house anymore. The words came almost automatically, but each syllable carried the weight of years of love that, in that moment, had faded into nothingness. She stood still, trying to formulate something, but I had already turned my back. And as I walked toward the door, I felt I was leaving behind not just that night, but an entire life I had built around her. The drive home was a blur. I remember walking in, looking at every corner as if for the last time, and feeling like everything there no longer belonged to me. I took only what I needed, I didn't have the strength to face the memories at that moment. There were no tears. What there was a piercing silence, the kind of silence that echoes inside and corrodes every good memory that tries to survive. When I closed the door, I knew something inside me had also closed forever. The following days were a mixture of anger, disbelief, and a strange sense of relief. I no longer woke up to her texts, nor did I have to pretend I didn't notice the distracted glances or cold replies. It was as if the weight of carrying a one-sided love had finally been lifted from my shoulders. Still, there was an emptiness. Not for her, but for what I had believed we were. The worst part of being betrayed isn't losing the person, but realizing they were never who you thought they were. I learned from mutual friends that, in the early days, she was still with him. Perhaps she believed that man could fill the space I'd left. But time proved otherwise. He didn't call, he didn't show up often, he treated her as something disposable. It was exactly what she had done to me. I won't deny there was a certain bitter taste of justice in that, but at the same time, the memory of what we'd been through prevented me from taking pleasure in seeing her suffer. Even so, I continued on my way. I avoided the places we frequented, changed my routine, and cut off any bridge that might lead back to that past. And then, one day, she reached out to me. The message came as an unexpected blow. It said she needed to talk, that she had things to clear up, that what she felt was true, and that she had made the biggest mistake of her life. For a moment, my fingers hovered over my phone, almost giving in to the temptation to reply. But I didn't. Silence was the only language that still made sense between us. The insistence came in the form of connections, messages left with friends, even unexpected appearances in places he knew I would be. Always with the same expression, of someone who realized too late that there was no turning back time. Months passed, and my life moved on. Little by little, I realized I no longer thought about her every day. I began meeting new people, smiling genuinely, rediscovering things I'd forgotten about. It was strange to realize the world kept spinning without her at its center. And somehow, that made me stronger. I learned that betrayal isn't just a breach of trust, it's also a silent ending that, however painful, begins a new chapter. That's when I decided to move to another city. Not to escape, but out of a desire to start over. A new landscape, new faces, no ghosts lurking around corners. And in that new place, I found something I'd never believed possible, peace. A peace that didn't depend on anyone, that came from the simple fact of having survived what I swore would destroy me. Life began to take on new contours, new colors. And in the midst of this process, I realized that forgiving didn't mean accepting back. Forgiving was simply releasing the burden. Fate, however, had other plans. One day, walking down a quiet street, on my way to a cafe, I saw her. She was thinner, her eyes heavy, as if the last few months had drained not only her joy but also the confidence she used to exude. She saw me, and instantly crossed the street, calling my name. There was no anger, no resentment. Just a strange feeling of being in front of someone who had once been the center of my world and was now just part of an ancient story. She asked to talk. I hesitated, but eventually accepted. We sat on a park bench, the cold wind blowing between us, and she began to speak. She said she regretted it, that nothing with that man was real, that she would give anything to go back. I listened, silently. When she finished, there were tears in her eyes, and maybe a little in mine too, but not for the same reasons. I said I forgave her. And it was true. There was no more anger in me. But there was also no more love. I told her that my life had moved on, that I was fine, that what we'd experienced would be part of who I am, but that there was no longer an us to rescue. She lowered her head, as if finally understanding. We stood in silence for a few minutes, watching people pass by, each with their own story, their own mistakes. Then we said goodbye. No hugs, no promises. Just the final goodbye of someone who knows there's nothing more they can do. The curious thing is that, as I got up and walked away, I didn't feel sad. I felt gratitude for having had the chance to close that chapter by looking into her eyes, without hate, without strings attached. And that's when life, once again, showed that it loves to test how far we're willing to go to start over. Because, that very day, something happened that would change the course of everything, and something she never could have imagined. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and never romanticize any type of betrayal. All stories are fictional and are intended to show how infidelity destroys lives, corrodes relationships, and leaves scars that time cannot erase. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is an intense, emotional, and shocking story. His name was Daniel, hers was Laura, and from their first meeting, it seemed the universe had devised a plan to bring them together. There was nothing extraordinary about the place where they met, but there was something about the way her eyes lit up when he made a simple comment, and something about the way he listened with genuine attention to every word she said. Laura was the kind of woman who filled spaces with a quiet energy, a rare combination of gentleness and firmness. Daniel, on the other hand, brought with him a solid presence, someone people naturally trusted. In the beginning, there were no exaggerated promises or theatrical gestures, just a slow approach, made up of long conversations, small meetings, and the gradual discovery of affinities that went far beyond the obvious. They liked each other for who they were when they were together, lighter, more authentic versions of themselves. Their life together began simply. A small apartment that wasn't luxurious at all, but held the feeling of a refuge. Every corner held a story, the sofa they bought on sale, the bookshelf they'd put together on a Saturday afternoon, the wine splatter marks on the wall that were never painted because they always said it was our thing. Mornings were punctuated by fresh coffee and conversations about the day ahead, and evenings often ended with low music and dimmed lights, discussing plans for the future. They weren't perfect, but they seemed to know how to deal with each other's imperfections. Daniel had his long silences when he was preoccupied, and Laura sometimes lost herself in details no one else noticed. But in the balance of their routine, this was never a problem. Friends said they were an inspiring couple, and in a way, they were. Not because of their excessive public displays, but because of the natural way they fit together. There was trust. There was care. And, most importantly, there was a mutual certainty that they could count on each other in good times and bad. When a work project of Daniel's nearly fell apart, Laura stood by him, offering not just words but also presence. When Laura went through a difficult time in her family, Daniel stood by her side, ready to solve whatever was needed. This mutual support became a kind of signature, a silent pact that they would always be there. Time shaped their relationship, and with it came new milestones, moving to a larger apartment, adopting a dog, and impromptu weekend trips that became favorite memories. Daniel loved observing Laura in new environments, with that curious way of noticing details, and she loved the way he seemed to adapt to any situation without losing his good humor. There was a lightness between them that made everything seem simpler. But, as in any true story, not everything was all color and light. Small disagreements began to emerge, nothing immediately shattering, but if ignored, they could create invisible cracks. Laura, naturally sociable, enjoyed going out with friends, attending events, and being on the move. Daniel, while also appreciative of this, was more selective about his time away from home, preferring quiet moments and smaller gatherings. Over time, these differences, once complementary, began to become more evident. Laura missed a more constant presence by her side on social occasions, while Daniel felt that some of these outings were more of an obligation than a pleasure. However, they always talked, finding a middle ground that seemed sufficient to maintain balance. At work, both were on the rise. Daniel was excelling in important projects, which made him increasingly sought after. Laura, meanwhile, was involved in a series of initiatives that required constant attendance at events, dinners, and meetings. This meant they spent less time together, and although they made an effort to compensate, there were nights when their absence felt like a burden. Still, each reunion brought back a sense of home, as if, once they closed the door, everything else could wait. Laura's circle of friends grew during this period, and this meant new faces, new stories, new social dynamics. Daniel, despite not knowing everyone intimately, trusted her enough not to worry. This trust was something that had been there from the beginning and, until then, had never been seriously tested. He was proud of the space she was carving out, and she was proud of his effort to pursue his own goals. When they saw each other at the end of a busy week, there was always an exchange of glances that said, "We're still here." Weekends became precious. When they weren't traveling, they enjoyed cooking together, watching old movies, or simply walking the dog. Small rituals took shape: Daniel's Sunday breakfast, Laura's afternoons reading while he worked on a personal project, the moments she would lie with her head in his lap while they talked about anything. These details, invisible to outsiders, were what made their relationship so strong. Their families had a good relationship, which made things much easier. Parties and celebrations were always pleasant moments, filled with stories, laughter, and the comfort that only the presence of loved ones provides. Daniel's parents clearly admired Laura, and she reciprocated with affection and respect. The same was true for her parents toward him. This family support further strengthened the bond between them. As the years passed, they began to talk about bigger plans. There was a mental list of places they wanted to visit together, improvements they wanted to make to the apartment, and even a timid conversation about having children in the future. These projections weren't fraught with haste, but rather a mutual understanding that, somehow, they were moving in the same direction. It was a path built patiently, without the need to rush, because there was an almost unshakable feeling that they would be together to achieve them. Despite the hustle and bustle of everyday life, they both maintained small gestures that strengthened their connection. Daniel always left a "good morning" message when he left before her, and Laura prepared his favorite dish on nights when she knew he would return tired. They weren't grand demonstrations, but these daily gestures carried enormous weight. It was as if, even in the face of all the external demands, they were saying to each other, "I see you." Friday nights, when they could, were dedicated to going out together. It could be dinner at a new restaurant or simply a walk around the neighborhood with a stop for ice cream. On these occasions, they would talk about anything from the trivial to the profound, laughing over old stories or discussing movies and books. These moments were a way to reconnect, to remember that, before any routine, they were two individuals who chose to be together. Everything indicated that, despite their differences and the adjustments life required, there was a strong bond between them, built over years of coexistence and mutual care. A bond that, to any observer, seemed unbreakable. And perhaps it was precisely this sense of solidity that made it seem as though nothing could shake what they had built. Until, unforeseeable, a sequence of events began to slowly transform the landscape of their relationship, subtly at first, almost imperceptibly, but with consequences that would change everything forever. Daniel and Laura lived a seemingly stable life, but little by little, the fast pace of their routines began to create empty spaces that hadn't existed before. Their schedules no longer coincided as before, and their evening get-togethers became increasingly brief. Laura was increasingly involved in events, meetings, and social dinners, always surrounded by new people. Daniel, consumed by deadlines and commitments, tried to maintain balance, but felt that quality time between them was becoming rare. Despite this, there were still gestures of care, as if each was trying, in their own way, to preserve something that was beginning to grow fragile. It was during this period that Laura began frequently mentioning names Daniel didn't recognize. They were colleagues, project partners, people who were part of that more expansive world she was immersing herself in. Daniel, trusting their bond, listened with interest but didn't ask questions in depth. He knew she was sociable and had always surrounded herself with friends, so he saw no reason to suspect anything. What Daniel didn't realize was that, among these new faces, there was one in particular who was beginning to take up more space than he should. The changes, at first, were subtle. Cell phone messages that were previously left on the table were now answered face down. Small delays to appointments became more frequent, always accompanied by plausible explanations. Laura was more attentive to her appearance, not only on event days but also on simple occasions, and although Daniel noticed, he attributed it to a natural desire to feel good. The hugs were still there, but less lingering. The kisses continued, but with a distraction that had previously been absent. Over time, an invisible distance began to form. It wasn't a physical absence, but an emotional one. Conversations, which had previously flowed easily, began to fragment. Laura avoided certain topics, responded more briefly, and always seemed to have something she needed to do. Daniel, for his part, wondered if he was demanding too much of her, if he shouldn't be more understanding given the pressure they both felt. There was a part of him that sensed something was different, but there was also the belief, almost blind, that the love they'd built was strong enough to weather any difficult phase. Then came the invitation to the company's couples' dinner. A formal event, scheduled for a Saturday night, bringing together partners and their guests in an elegant setting. Daniel, even tired, saw it as an opportunity to spend more time with Laura, to reconnect in some way. She confirmed her attendance, but with an almost imperceptible hesitation that he couldn't decipher at the time. During the week leading up to the dinner, Daniel made simple plans: leave work early, pick out a tie she liked, and try, at least for that night, to rekindle the connection that seemed distant. The day of the event arrived, and he was a few minutes late due to an unexpected event at work. He texted her to let her know he was on his way, hoping to meet her at the entrance or in the ballroom. Upon arriving, he noticed the brightly lit room, the soft sound of live music, and the murmur of voices mingled with the clinking of glasses. He greeted a few acquaintances, and then his eyes scanned the room in search of her. When he finally found her, something inside him stopped. She was sitting at the table, laughing, with an expression he knew well, but which at that moment seemed out of place. Beside her, a man he'd never seen before, impeccably dressed, leaned toward her as if they shared a secret. Daniel's body reacted before he could fully process it, a tightness in his chest, his breath short, a feeling of disbelief mixed with a pang of nausea. For a few seconds, the sound of the surroundings seemed to fade, and all he could see was the scene before him. There was something in her gaze that left no doubt. It wasn't the look one exchanges with a friend or coworker. It was intimate, too close for him to find an innocent explanation. Even so, he tried to rationalize: perhaps it was someone she knew and hadn't mentioned, perhaps she'd been placed at that table by chance. But as he observed their posture, the way they leaned toward each other, the way their hands almost touched on the tablecloth, every innocent hypothesis fell apart. The footsteps that led him to the table felt heavier than anything she had ever felt. As she approached, she saw him. And in that instant, the expression on her face changed. It wasn't pure surprise, nor joy. It was a mixture of shock and discomfort, as if she'd been caught in a moment she shouldn't have been. He held her gaze, unwavering, and when he reached her side, the words that came out of his mouth weren't the result of an angry impulse, but a split-second decision. He said, his voice firm, that it was clear she already had a date for that evening, that he didn't need to stay, and that there would be no reason for her to worry about his presence in the house they shared. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any explanation she could offer. The man beside him remained silent, with a slight smile that Daniel couldn't tell if it was one of superiority or nervousness. Laura said nothing, and in the gap between her words, Daniel understood there was no misunderstanding to be clarified. Without raising his voice, without creating a scene, he turned and walked toward the exit. Each step seemed to seal a decision he knew was irreversible. Outside, the cool night air hit his face, but brought no relief. There was a heaviness that wouldn't lift, a knot in his stomach that made it clear something had broken forever. He still didn't know what he would do next, or what the next few days would be like, but he was certain nothing would ever be the same again. As he got into the car, the images of that night replayed in his mind, like a sequence of scenes he wished he could erase, but knew would be etched in his memory forever. That night, as he closed the door behind him, silence enveloped him again. A different silence, not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that carries the absence of something lost. He knew that, from then on, any step he took would take him away from the life he knew. And, although he wasn't yet aware of all that was to come, a part of him sensed that the wound opened that night would only be the beginning of something much greater. Something that, sooner or later, would surface with enough force to change the course of everyone involved. Daniel didn't return home that night, nor the following. He spent days without responding to Laura's attempts to contact him, letting his silence speak for him. She, in turn, tried every means possible to reach out, from short messages asking to talk to persistent calls. When she got no response, she began reaching out to mutual acquaintances, hoping one of them could convince him to listen. But Daniel, even shaken, knew that any hasty encounter could lead to a conversation filled with hurt and accusations. He needed time to process what he had seen, to find the right words, not to explain, but to bring closure. It was a few weeks later that the inevitable meeting happened. It wasn't at a prearranged location, nor was it the result of planning. Chance, or something resembling it, brought them face to face on a quiet street late one afternoon. Laura was visibly different. Her gaze held an exhaustion that wasn't just physical, and her posture, once confident, now held a weight. Seeing him, she hesitated for a moment, as if considering crossing to the other side of the street. But she didn't. She approached with uncertain steps, until she stopped in front of him. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low and tense, avoiding direct eye contact. Daniel remained motionless for a few seconds, debating whether it was worth giving in to the conversation she so desperately sought. But something in the way she held her hands, as if trying to contain a tremor, made him agree. They walked to a nearby bench and sat down. The light wind carried the scent of wet earth, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke. "I was wrong," she began, taking a deep breath. "There's no other way to put it. I was wrong with you, with what we built. I won't justify myself, because no excuse can erase what I did. I just want you to know that I regret every choice that led me to that moment." The words came quickly, as if she feared his silence was a sign that he would get up at any moment and leave. Daniel watched her but didn't interrupt. She continued, her voice now cracking. "I thought I was looking for something I was missing, but the truth is, I already had it all. And I lost it. I lost it because I didn't realize what was in my hands." He closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the confession. When he spoke, it was in a calm but firm tone. "You didn't just hurt me, Laura. You took away my foundation. And the worst part is, it wasn't all in one moment, it was a series of small things, until one night I saw it all fall apart. I truly loved you. And you chose someone who meant nothing to you, and who clearly doesn't see you the way I do. She bit her lip, trying to hold back the tears. I know. And that's why I need to tell you something I couldn't before. I thought after that night everything was over, but it wasn't. After you left, I discovered what it's like to live without you. I discovered that there's nothing emptier than waking up and not having your voice to calm me, not having your gaze tell me everything was okay, even when it wasn't. Daniel took a deep breath, looking away to the horizon. You're telling me this now because he didn't stay. I know. Someone who truly wants to be with someone doesn't disappear at the first sign of difficulty. He disappeared, didn't he? She hesitated before answering. Gone. And that made me understand what I did to you. I was to you what he was to me. A temporary presence, a mistake that only served to hurt. For a few seconds, Daniel just watched her. It was clear she was broken in a way he didn't know how to fix. But something in him no longer reacted the same way. The weight of his hurt had been replaced by a strange clarity. And it was this clarity that made him say, his voice calm, I forgive you, Laura. But it's not about getting back together. It's about moving forward. The two of us. Separated. She looked up, surprised. You, forgive me? Yes, he replied without hesitation. Because carrying this around with me would only keep me trapped in the same place. I don't want to live trapped in what happened. I want to live free. But freedom also means not going back to what destroyed me. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the tension-filled silence of dinner night, but an emptiness that signaled an inevitable end. Laura ran her hand over her face, trying to wipe away the tears, and nodded slightly. I understand. I just hope that one day you'll be able to remember me without pain. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He simply stood, and she did the same. For a moment, they stood face to face, like two people who had once been everything to each other but were now nothing more than closed chapters. He took a step back, and she understood it was a farewell. There was no hug. There was no handshake. Just the slow drifting apart of two people who, despite everything, still recognized each other's gaze, but knew there was no longer a common path. What Laura didn't know, and what she discovered later, was that Daniel had already moved to another city. He'd made the decision weeks earlier, but hadn't told anyone. It wasn't to escape her, but because I felt I needed a completely new setting to rebuild my life. I'd found a place where I could walk without fear of bumping into memories, where I could start over without carrying the shadow of what had happened. This secret, which she only discovered much later, reached her unexpectedly, through a mutual acquaintance who, unknowingly, revealed that Daniel was already living far away, with new plans and a life that no longer included any possibility of reunion. When this truth hit her, she realized that the forgiveness she received was not an invitation to try again, but the final key he used to close the door between them once and for all. And this realization left her with a void that nothing else could fill. Daniel received the news that Laura had discovered the change like someone hearing a rain forecast after having already weathered a storm. There was no euphoria, no triumph, just confirmation that what he had silently decided had now reached the other end of the rope. He walked streets that still lacked the scent of his old life, learned the times when the sun hit the windows of his new apartment, memorized the specific sound of the bus that passed at 6:20, opened the window every morning and breathed with a care that seemed ritualistic. When the phone vibrated and her name appeared, he hesitated, but answered. Not out of nostalgia, not out of weakness, but because the decision he had made involved courage. She spoke slowly, her voice wavering between caution and pleading, saying she needed to see him in person, not to argue, nor to reopen wounds, but to return something that, according to her, could not be kept in his hands. He asked what it was, and she replied that it was just a box, and inside it, the rest that still connected them. He agreed with an "okay, come tomorrow," and was able to end the call without needing to explain himself. The next day, he chose a corner cafe with wooden tables and the scent of cinnamon, a place where the constant movement would shield him from the noise. He arrived early, chose a table by the window, and ordered a strong coffee and sparkling water. When Laura entered, the room seemed to shrink. She carried a brown paper box against her chest, as if protecting something too fragile to withstand any impact. He sat down without leaning in for a hug, without attempting any mechanical cordiality. The silence, for a few seconds, did the job of any introduction. She pushed the box onto the tabletop and said it contained old letters, movie tickets they'd kept unnecessarily, a mug with a small chip that had always been his favorite, a scarf he'd forgotten the other winter day, 2 photos she couldn't keep without feeling like she was committing a crime. Daniel ran his hand over the lid, without opening it, as if the gesture were a ritual, and nodded. "Thank you for bringing it," he said, and she took a breath, as if preparing to dive in. Laura talked about the first night she slept without him in the weeks following dinner, about the discomfort of opening the refrigerator and finding nothing that resembled his habits, about the echo the house made when she tried to turn on the television just to avoid hearing her own guilt, about the feeling of walking down hallways where the walls seemed to return questions. She admitted she tried to convince herself it was just a phase, confessed she sought out the other man for a few days until she realized the connection she imagined never existed, that it was just a reflection of herself seeking approval where there was no promise. "I'm not here to ask you to come back, I know that doesn't exist anymore," she said, holding his gaze for the first time, with a painful firmness. "I'm here because I can't forgive myself if I don't tell you clearly that I understand. I understand the extent of the damage, and I understand that I was the person I always swore I'd never be." Daniel didn't lower his eyes, didn't look away from her to the window, didn't run for the sugar in his coffee. He simply replied that he appreciated her honesty, but that he didn't need to hear details, that the big picture said it all. "I don't want you to leave here carrying what I decided to let go of," he added, and she bit the inside of her lip, an old gesture he recognized more as a reflex than a charm. The conversation changed tone when she said she'd learned about the move by chance, in a casual conversation with someone who'd seen him there, and that, upon hearing it, she'd felt first a void, then a kind of respect. "I thought you'd disappeared out of spite," she said, "but I realized you hadn't, you just didn't want to live inside what hurt you." Daniel nodded again and calmly explained that the decision hadn't been against her, but in his favor. "I needed to look at myself in the mirror without the scenery glued to my face," he said, a little surprised by the metaphor that slipped out, "and I didn't want to spend the next few years avoiding streets, memories, corners. Here, I don't need to dodge anything, I just live." She took a deep breath and commented that some forgivenesses sound like absolution, and others that sound like a warning, and that his was both. "If I could take it back," she said, and he interrupted her without aggression, simply with a raised hand, asking her not to say it. "Time doesn't work for us that way," he murmured, and his voice didn't tremble. Outside, a light drizzle began to make streaks on the glass. Laura ordered tea, and while they waited, she took a smaller envelope from her bag, already slightly frayed at the edges, and placed it on the table. She said they were 2 letters she'd written but never sent, one the day after dinner, the other last week, and that she hadn't expected him to read them there, or even one day, but needed them to be with him so the words would reach the right recipient, even if they remained unopened. Daniel ran his finger along the line of the envelope and replied that he might never open it, not out of disdain, but because sometimes respect is born from not invading territory where the past still screams. "What I needed to hear, you've already said, and what I needed to say, I said," he concluded. She nodded, accepting that certain figures of speech were now the terrain where they could meet without stumbling. The first spark of real tension appeared when Laura asked if there was anyone in that city. She didn't ask with open jealousy, but with the caution of someone who knows that certain answers hurt because of their nakedness. Daniel took a moment to answer and avoided any excitement, choosing the truth without fuss. He said no, that there were new conversations, faces that crossed his path, laughter shared with strangers in bakery lines and with neighbors who offered to borrow tools, that there were small friendships with people who shared tables in crowded cafes, but that he hadn't yet asked for a name. "I didn't come here looking for someone," he explained, "I came looking for myself." Laura lowered her eyes and let out an "I see" that seemed at once sincere and bitter, and, in an impulse that mixed regret and gratitude, she placed her hand on the table as if to touch his, but stopped a few inches away, retracting her fingers as if respecting an invisible boundary. They then discussed something rarely discussed, what betrayal does to the betrayed person's identity, how a person needs to relearn to trust themselves more than others, how the body creates memories that manifest in involuntary reactions, in a street corner, in a song, in the smell of someone else's coat. Daniel, with calm honesty, said he didn't intend to carry the label of betrayed as fate, that he refused to make the episode the central theme of his biography. "That's not me," he said, and his tone, without anger, was more powerful than any inflammatory speech. "I went through it, and moving forward is the only thing that matters to me." Laura, in a lower voice, commented that sometimes the greatest punishment is realizing that the other person managed to do what you can't, which is to keep going without constantly looking back. Daniel didn't celebrate, didn't use it as a victory, simply saying that everyone has their own speed, but that he needed to ensure that their speeds no longer crossed. As the rain intensified, the bar grew more crowded, and the conversation took on waves of silence that came and went. During one of these pauses, a waitress brought an extra napkin and asked if they needed anything. Laura thanked her with a polite smile, and when the waitress walked away, Laura observed, trying to make humor where there was only politeness, that it seemed like everyone in that place offered simple things without asking for anything in return. Daniel replied that perhaps that was the charm of the city, or perhaps it was just the look of someone who decided to stop looking for wounds in every gesture. The comment drew a near smile from her, which disappeared too quickly to be joy. Some memories surfaced in their eyes, but none of them were brought to the table. That's when Laura asked for one last question and said she promised not to cross that line. She wanted to know if, on the day of the dinner, he had already prepared those words, if he had planned his departure, or if it all came together there, in the heat of the moment. Daniel thought for a second and replied that there was no speech, that phrases were the only dignified way to say goodbye to himself in public without tearing away what remained of respect. "I didn't want to be the ugly part of the story that was already ugly enough," he said, "and at that moment I only had two paths, one was to break everything on the outside, the other was to protect myself on the inside. I chose the latter." Laura nodded, tears held back, and whispered a thank you that wasn't for sparing her that day, but for keeping something whole in him, even though he was the one bleeding. The farewell began without announcement, like things that happen when there's nothing left to say. Laura gathered up her bag, he held the box, she fixed her hair in a futile attempt to appear composed, and they both stood up simultaneously. The moment they were side by side, without the tabletop as a barrier, she looked directly at him and said that if a beautiful memory ever insisted on surfacing, to let it, not to banish it out of anger at what came after. "Not to remember me, but to remember you in that memory," she said, and that, more than a request, sounded like the surrender of someone who had finally learned the difference between possession and remembrance. Daniel replied that he would let it pass, as one lets the sun shine through a window even when one has no control over the climate, and that was enough. Outside, the rain had become a thin curtain. They walked together for a few meters, until they reached a corner where their paths naturally diverged. Laura stopped first, took a deep breath, and unceremoniously said she wouldn't ask for anything else, not a date, not a message, not a chance. "You've already given me the one thing I couldn't give myself," she said, her voice firm again, "you gave me a full stop I didn't have the courage to write." He nodded, and for a second the word goodbye seemed too big to fit in the air, so she simply took 2 steps back, raised her hand in a small gesture, and turned away. Daniel watched until she disappeared around the corner, not because he was watching her leave, but because he understood that watching someone leave is sometimes the most honest way of acknowledging that it was real. When he went back inside to pay the bill, the clerk kindly asked if everything was okay. He said yes, and that he needed to go for a walk before heading home. As he dropped some bills on the wooden tray, he realized he was still holding the envelope containing the letters. He placed it inside the box, carefully closed it, and stepped out into the street. The rain, now almost non-existent, left the ground glistening, and he walked unhurriedly, as if learning a city by touch. As he passed a newsstand, a book in the window caught his eye. It was an old edition of short stories he'd always wanted to reread but never found. He smiled slightly, went in, chatted briefly with the vendor, and left with the book under his arm. The scene, banal to anyone, had an extraordinary dimension for him, the world fit again into a simple gesture. In the apartment, he opened the box and took out only the mug with the splinter. He washed it, filled it with coffee, and leaned it against the window. The envelope remained on the table, intact. He felt no obligation, and in that lack of obligation, there was a sweet freedom. He picked up his phone, deleted the last conversation with Laura so as not to be drawn into habits, saved a reminder to listen to an old song he discovered by chance that day, and then left the device face down, unafraid of missing anything. Night fell without warning, and, on the other side of the city, someone turned on a light that he saw reflected in the glass, as if it were a silent code for other lives happening. Meanwhile, Laura arrived at a simple hotel room, placed her bag on the chair, and sat down on the bed with the care of someone settling into a place she doesn't want to call temporary. She picked up her cell phone, not to call, but to jot down a phrase she wanted to remember: forgiveness isn't a bridge to return, it's a road to follow. She lay down without opening any net, without seeking immediate distractions, closed her eyes, and, for the first time in a long time, allowed herself to cry cleanly, without anger, without self-justification, just mourning for what no longer exists. When the crying stopped, she sat back down, wrote 3 lines in a notebook, put the notebook in her suitcase, and turned out the light. The room fell silent, and for a few minutes, the silence didn't overwhelm her. The next morning, Daniel went down to run along the edge of the park, a habit he was trying to establish without overdoing it. The air had a freshness that tickled his lungs, and his body, finally, wasn't screaming alarm at every memory. On the way back, he stopped at a small market to buy fruit, and in the line, a woman dropped her keys. He bent down and returned them, and she smiled with affectionate gratitude, commenting that kind hands save days. He responded with a light joke and left with the bag. He wasn't euphoric, there was no grandiose soundtrack, but there was the serenity of the ground no longer trembling. At home, he placed the mug on the most visible shelf, not as a trophy of pain, but as a reminder that even chipped things can remain useful, beautiful in their own way. Later, with the sun already high in the sky, he passed by the gate and met the neighbor who always greeted him with a discreet wave. She commented on the weather and the street market that would be happening later that afternoon, and he said he might stop by, perhaps buy fresh bread and some flowers for the sideboard. The conversation was short and simple, without innuendo, without promises, just 2 people testing the lightness of good manners. He climbed the stairs with a thought that didn't hurt: the next steps didn't need a map, they just needed to walk. At the end of that day, as the yellow light from the lamps filled the room, Daniel opened the newly purchased book and let the stories pull him out of himself, into plots where other hearts also learned to remake themselves with the gentlest possible care. On the marked page, a sentence stood out as if waiting for him: sometimes, what remains is the best thing you can have, because it's what doesn't lie. He closed the book carefully and rested his forehead against the cool glass of the window. There was no expectation of return, no need for any grand finale. There was, indeed, a quiet that seemed rare, and, outside, the city breathed its own rhythm, welcoming those who arrived without asking where they came from. Somewhere, Laura was packing her suitcase to return, with less weight and more awareness. In another place, Daniel was folding his market ticket and putting it in his pocket, ready to walk among the stalls, try some cheese, listen to a guitar played by someone who firmly believed that life always offers a new song. History wasn't being rewritten, but life, yes, remained open like a street too long to see its end all at once, and because of that, irresistible. Daniel realized that the conversation over coffee with Laura had left him with less of a burden than he'd imagined, but it had also awakened something he hadn't expected: an uncomfortable reflection on the extent to which forgiveness liberates and the extent to which it also carries within itself a kind of invisible prison. It was as if, by forgiving, he'd signed a silent agreement not to go back on any decision, not even in those moments when loneliness crept through the cracks in his routine. He walked around the apartment as if measuring conquered territory, but the sense of achievement wasn't celebratory. It was more like the awareness that this space was now a faithful reflection of what he had become: organized, silent, and at the same time harboring an echo of stories that wouldn't fade, only retreated into corners. Over the next few days, he maintained the simple routine he'd established: work, runs in the park, evening reading, small talk with neighbors. But something about interacting with others began to take on a different meaning. An upstairs neighbor, Clara, began passing him frequently in the lobby and in the elevator. There were no obvious innuendos, but a genuine interest in the small exchanges, a comment about the smell of baking bread coming from some apartment, a recommendation of a flower stand tucked away on a narrow street, a spontaneous offer of a piece of cake she'd baked. Daniel noticed that, little by little, these encounters awakened something in him that no longer had to do with memories, but with the simple desire to share the present. Still, there was resistance. He wondered if he was ready to look at someone without the filter of comparisons, without seeking similarities or differences with Laura. And, more than that, getting involved again would mean taking the risk of someone else gaining access to the parts of him that took so long to heal. Clara seemed unhurried, understanding silences as a natural part of conversation, but that didn't stop Daniel from facing a moral dilemma. Allowing a new relationship to emerge could be interpreted as a natural step or as a shortcut to not fully confronting the wounds. As he pondered this, an unexpected event further complicated this dilemma. One afternoon, he received a short message from a number he hadn't saved. It was Laura. The text simply said, "Can I meet you? Not to talk about us, but about something I need to take care of." It took him almost an hour to respond, agreeing only because the message carried a different tone, as if it were urgent but not emotional. They arranged to meet on a park bench, at a time when the crowds were low. When she arrived, she seemed calmer than the last time. She sat down and got straight to the point. She wanted to know if he could help her make a difficult decision. It didn't involve asking for love advice or reopening conversations about the past, but rather a family problem that required the presence of someone she trusted, someone who wasn't interested in manipulating the situation. Daniel was silent for a few seconds. Part of him felt inclined to help. After all, he no longer held a grudge. But another part knew that accepting would mean crossing a boundary he had worked hard to establish. He asked why she didn't turn to someone else. Laura said that, although she had friends and family, none of them shared his clarity and objectivity, and that she knew he wouldn't distort anything to favor one side. The request, rational as it was, reopened an internal debate. Helping could be a gesture of humanity and consistency with the forgiveness he claimed to have given, but it could also blur the lines and reopen the door to interpretations he didn't want to exist. In the days that followed, Daniel reflected deeply on the question. While he wanted to keep his life free from ties to the past, he recognized that his forgiveness could not be selective. He could not pride himself on forgiving and, at the same time, refuse to reach out when it didn't involve reviving the relationship. This contradiction led him to realize that the moral dilemma wasn't just about Laura, but about the kind of man he wanted to be from then on. To be someone who acts according to principles, even when uncomfortable, or someone who closes all doors to avoid any risk of pain. He chose to help, but made it clear from the outset that there was no room for misunderstanding. He would help with whatever was needed, but after that, each would go their own way. Laura accepted without question, and together they dealt with the issues she had mentioned. Upon witnessing the situation, Daniel maintained his neutral, direct, and practical demeanor, as he had promised. When everything was resolved, Laura thanked him quietly, without any attempt to prolong the moment. There was a tacit acknowledgement that this gesture was not a fresh start, but rather the last possible demonstration of respect between two closed chapters. Upon returning home, Daniel felt an unexpected lightness. Contrary to his fears, the help didn't bring confusion or open wounds. On the contrary, it served as a kind of definitive closure. He realized he didn't need to protect himself in every possible way. True closure came from knowing how to act without losing himself in the process. This realization made it easier to allow new possibilities to emerge. The following week, he ran into Clara again in the hall. Her hands were full of shopping bags and a small pot of lavender. He offered to help, and she accepted with a wide smile. They went upstairs together, and the conversation was light, about the scent of herbs, recipes that paired well with lavender, and how plants changed the atmosphere of a place. Daniel found himself imagining the lavender in Clara's window and felt it was okay to be curious. Even so, he was in no rush. His conversations with Clara were loose fragments of something that might grow, but which, at that moment, didn't need to be named. What mattered was that he no longer carried that suffocating hesitation that had previously prevented him from looking forward. He was willing to, little by little, make room for new stories, but now without the need to prove anything to himself. And as the hours passed and he organized his days into a more serene rhythm, Daniel knew the next step would come naturally. The moral dilemma he had faced had made it clear that life is made of choices that don't always yield a perfect answer, but that shape who we are and how we move forward. He was ready to accept this truth and, more than that, to use it as a guide. At that moment, there was no rush for the end, but there was the certainty that when it arrived, it would not be a forced closure, but rather a conclusion that would be born at the right pace, with the same honesty that now sustained his every gesture. The weeks following Daniel's offer of help unfolded into days of newfound tranquility, as if life had understood his plea for clarity and now responded with small, practical gestures. The apartment took on scents that hadn't existed before, the nutty coffee he'd brought from a small roastery, the scent of lavender Clara mentioned and which he'd ended up buying for his own window, the lemon soap a small grocery store had sold out of curiosity and which lingered, reminding him with each shower that new beginnings have discrete textures. The nights were no longer hostile territory. There were books that drew him out of himself, series he watched without the anxiety of filling a void, songs that played and faded without triggering old alarms. The silent phone was no longer a vigilante or a threat, it was just an object. Some late afternoons, Daniel would return from the park by a longer route just to watch the street above take on the golden light of 6 o'clock, and that was his luxury, choosing his direction without running away from anything. Clara appeared in unpretentious moments, and perhaps that was the greatest relief, because Daniel didn't need to act, just be there. One Saturday, he went downstairs to pick up a shopping bag and found her downstairs, holding a huge box and a smile asking for help. He offered to help, she accepted, and they went upstairs, laughing about the awkwardness of asking strangers for help and the ease of ordering a pizza. Inside her apartment, the smell of freshly baked bread mingled with that of plants, and Daniel commented that some houses have music even when they're silent. Clara replied that it was a good definition of peace and asked if he wanted to try the bread, still warm. He said yes, and the yes wasn't about the bread, it was about the permission to occupy new chairs without feeling intruded. They talked about simple things, but Daniel realized that simplicity is sometimes just another form of depth. He said he started running again, she said nothing calmed her more than watering plants in silence, and he remembered that like someone writing down a map. The dilemma that haunted him, of entering a new story without turning the person into a cure for old ones, took on less threatening contours when Clara casually proposed a coffee date, without promises or implications. "If you want," she said, and the phrase carried no subtext, just an uncompromising invitation. Daniel hesitated for a second, but the hesitation wasn't from fear, it came from eagerness to step forward. "I want," she replied, her tone one of someone offering themselves without pretense. They found a small cafe, iron tables, plants on the wall, and a chalkboard scrawled with cake names. Daniel realized, during the conversation, that he wasn't as self-conscious as he'd imagined he would be with someone new. Clara's curiosity was attentive and non-invasive, she wasn't eager for biographies, preferring loose stories, fragments that fit together without forcing a puzzle. At one point, she commented that everyone has a before and an after, and that what she admired most in people was their honesty in acknowledging what broke them without making a fuss about it. Daniel nodded with a small smile, grateful not to have to explain what was already clear between the lines. On the way home, a message appeared on the screen, an unknown number asking for a quick meeting to talk with him about a volunteer activity in the neighborhood, a reading circle with young people seeking inspiration for writing and listening. Daniel found it strange, but curiosity led him to accept. In the community center room, children and teenagers huddled with worn notebooks and alert eyes. He was introduced as someone who loved words and could talk about how stories help organize the world. Seeing those raised hands, Daniel understood there was a kind of new beginning that doesn't involve romance, that begins when we become useful again. He talked about reading, about how jotting down phrases saves us from bad days, about how what we don't say always finds a way to leak out if it's shoved into the basement. At the end, a boy asked if writing erased things. "It doesn't erase, but puts it in a drawer where you know it's there," he said, and saw some nod with the gravity of someone discovering a tool. Clara showed up one afternoon to leave a cake at the center's entrance with a short note, and Daniel interpreted the gesture for what it was: care without an audience. When he thanked her, she simply replied that it was good to know there were people there who gave back to the neighborhood what the neighborhood gives every day. He smiled, and the smile brought a slight rush of something akin to complete joy, without guilt. It was in this context that an opportunity arose for them to go together to a street fair, with scattered musicians and artisan stalls. They walked amidst colors and sounds, stopping whenever they wanted, without the obligation to fill the silence. In front of a makeshift second-hand bookstore, Clara found a book of old photographs and commented that she loves it when time fits in the frame and not around her neck. Daniel thought about how often we cling to what has already happened and realized that, with her, the phrase didn't become a sermon, it became poetry. In the midst of this process, an unexpected event threatened to disrupt the newly found balance. On a cloudy morning, Laura sent one last message. She didn't ask for a meeting, didn't promise to talk, just a warning: she was leaving. She said she'd found a job in another region and that, before leaving, she wanted to make it clear that she would forever respect the path he'd chosen. She thanked him for what was and what wasn't, and said goodbye with the sobriety of someone who's learned the difference between what one desires and what one allows. Daniel read it twice, took a breath, replied that he wished her good luck, and ended a cycle without a fuss. There was no explosion, no catharsis, just the maturity of a goodbye that doesn't hurt. He put the phone in his pocket and decided not to tell anyone, not out of secrecy, but because some things, when said, lose the exact weight they need to settle inside. It was that same day that Clara invited him to an outdoor performance in the late afternoon, a string trio performing in the square. He accepted, and the encounter brought with it an unexpected event that would turn into a dialogue Daniel hadn't anticipated, a tender test of how he saw himself. After a few songs, sitting on a bench, Clara commented that sometimes we confuse strength with the inability to ask. Daniel asked what she was talking about, and she carefully said that she noticed in him a constant effort to make everything light so as not to weigh anyone down, and that this was beautiful, but sometimes it caused him to withdraw a bit from the scene when the scene needed him fully there. "If I ever cross a line, tell me," she asked, "but if I ever stay behind a line you wanted me to cross, tell me too." Daniel was silent for a few seconds, smiled at the corner of his mouth, and replied that he was learning, and that thanking was a way of saying stay, and he was grateful. That night, he returned home with a different serenity, that of someone who accepts that caring also means letting oneself be cared for. He made tea, opened his storybook, and, without realizing it, fell asleep on the couch. He woke in the early morning with a clear head and a clear memory of a conversation he'd had with the young people in the reading circle. When someone asked how to know if a chapter was finished, he'd replied that we know because the characters no longer fit in that room. He smiled at his own belated answer and understood that, in fact, he no longer fit in the rooms where he tried to make himself bigger by shrinking. On a sunny, uncertain Sunday, Clara invited him for a walk in a more remote park, with a lookout point famous for its sweeping views of the city, requiring no selfies. They arrived early, chatting about kitchens that hold stories, about voices that sound like homes, about how some people teach us the value of locking doors from the inside without locking windows. At the top of the lookout point, a firm breeze ruffled Clara's hair, and she laughed without vanity. Daniel, accustomed to analyzing everything, decided, in that moment, to simply feel. And he felt a calm that had no questions, a comfort that required no credentials, a confidence that settled into his body without asking permission. Clara noticed something in his gaze and didn't ask what it was, because she had learned to listen to silences. Life, at this stage, didn't need to look for proof that it was working, it showed itself in gestures. Daniel began frequenting the bakery on the corner on Saturday mornings because the baker played oldies there, and the world seemed to have more space. On one of those Saturdays, he found Clara with a bag of fruit and an impromptu invitation, come have lunch with me, I'm going to test a sauce I'm not sure is good. He accepted, and in her kitchen, the scene unfolded with the kind of precision that brooks no rush, a pan on low heat, laughter over the excess of herbs, discussions about the superiority of Sicilian lemon for fish, a glass of wine that asked for nothing more than it had. At one point, Clara leaned against the counter and bluntly stated that she was afraid of becoming someone's fix-it, and that she didn't want that for her or him. If we walk, let it be because the view is beautiful, not because we're running from a fire, she said, and Daniel replied that fires were now a matter for firefighters, not his heart. Along these lines, a moral dilemma resurfaced in a different guise, demanding a decision from Daniel without drama, but with precision. One of the young people in the reading circle had gotten into trouble at school and needed an adult to mediate a conversation with the administration. The boy asked Daniel to be that adult. There were questions about boundaries, what his role was in that space, how far he could commit without becoming a crutch, how to offer support without taking a place that wasn't his. He talked to Clara about this, and she, far from giving him an opinion on what he should do, returned questions that guided him to listen to his own judgment. Daniel decided to go, not as a savior, but as a responsible witness. In the meeting, he didn't say more than he should, didn't dramatize, didn't romanticize the boy's rebelliousness, but helped convey what needed to be heard without humiliation. As he left, the boy told him, with the emotional economy of adolescence, that it was the first time he felt someone saw him without wanting to fix him. Daniel returned home with the feeling that being useful has no audience, and he kept this like someone who keeps a compass. At the end of an afternoon that began cloudy and ended with a sky that insisted on opening, Daniel and Clara sat on the front step of the building, each with a cup of coffee, and talked about the difference between promises and commitments. Daniel tried to put into words something that had been slowly maturing, saying that promises are the things we say to the future in an attempt to tame it, while commitments are the gestures we give to the present so that the future has something to feed on. Clara listened and replied that she liked the latter because it fits in her hand and doesn't need a hopeful audience, and he agreed, surprised by his own serenity. Then she asked, with unpressured frankness, if he felt ready for a commitment that reflected her face, not a promise, but a real movement, with flaws and adjustments. Daniel didn't rush his answer. She looked at the street, measured her breath, and said yes, but with one request, that if she ever sensed in him shadows of a chapter that didn't belong to them, she would call him back to the present. Clara nodded, not with a speech, but with a look that said, "I'll be there when you call." At a later meeting, the topic was the honesty of origins. Daniel told stories from his childhood, not as an inventory of traumas, but as a map of affections that explained certain habits, like folding the edges of a tablecloth the right way and storing books in order of impact, not by author. Clara spoke of her grandmother who taught her to care for plants as if they were voices, of the street where she learned to love the noise of a market, of her fear of grandiose promises, because she'd seen promises broken with a bang. In the end, Daniel felt he was offering something legitimate, not the perfect version of himself, but the version he recognized when he was alone. There was no euphoria, no announcement, but when she said goodbye with a brief kiss at the apartment door, he understood that things were moving in the right direction, at the pace they'd chosen together. And it was precisely at this point of equilibrium that chance tested the boundaries once again. One night at a cultural event in the square, Daniel spotted, from afar, a figure he recognized before his brain could accept it, Laura. She didn't see him, and he stood still for a second, a whirlwind of memories trying, without permission, to take over the scene. Clara, noticing something change in his gaze, gently asked if everything was okay. Daniel took a breath, said yes, and, after a brief silence, explained that this person was part of an ancient story. Clara made a small gesture of understanding, didn't ask for details, didn't suggest escape, didn't hold his hand as if arming herself against a ghost, just stood there, present. Laura passed them a few feet away, and the world didn't fall apart. There was no confrontation, no silent words and glances, no relapse. There was the silent testing of a scar that no longer healed. When the trio on stage changed songs, Daniel realized he was whole where he was. "Want to stay a little longer?" he asked. "I do," Clara replied, and the word landed on both of them like a bird accustomed to the shoulder. Back at the apartment, Daniel opened the window and let the night air in. It wasn't a rehearsed symbolic gesture, it was simply what one does when the house needs movement. He thought, without drama, that life had taken enough turns to prove that certain endings must happen for other beginnings to have meaning. It wasn't about comparison, it was about adaptation. The moral of this journey, he intuited, wasn't revenge, nor the measure of justice the world sometimes offers imperfectly, it was about respect. Respect for oneself, for what one chooses, for what isn't negotiable. He picked up his phone, typed a short message to Clara, "Thank you for today, for staying where I was," and received a response that fit exactly, "I like being where you are, when you are." The next day, a gentle rain washed the streets, and Daniel felt like cooking. He prepared a simple sauce, calmly chopped vegetables, and let the music fill the kitchen. Halfway through, the doorbell rang. Clara appeared with a huge umbrella and a basket of bread, saying the sky had convinced her that soup and bread were a non-negotiable combination. She entered bringing the smell of wet streets and the lightness of someone who knows where they're stepping. They ate leisurely, laughing at small culinary disasters. At one point, Clara became serious and said she wanted to agree on one thing, that if their story ever required a pause, it would be spoken aloud, not practiced in silence, because long silences turn people into assumptions. Daniel agreed with a tightness in his chest that wasn't fear, but caution, and toasted with water, because sometimes solemnity fits in what is alcohol-free. As the night deepened, Clara approached the bookshelf and pulled out a random book, leafing through it leisurely, and found an old dedication that brought no ghosts, only proof that Daniel had a life before, and that this is one of the few truths that make us equal. He realized she knew how to read memories without invading them, and this eased any shadows that might have arisen. As they said goodbye, she hugged him for just the right amount of time, and he understood there was a clear difference between hugs that ask for things and hugs that offer ground. This sequence of days paved the invisible ground for what would come in the resolution, not with shocking twists and turns, but with choices aligned with what had become non-negotiable: honesty, presence, respect for the rhythm. Daniel no longer constantly asked himself if he was ready, because the question itself had lost its usefulness. Instead, he took a short list of concrete tasks into the next morning: buy more coffee, bring books to the reading circle, ask Clara if she wanted to visit the viewpoint at another time of day to see how the light changes the same landscape. These were simple tasks that quietly bore the signature of someone who decided to live in the right time, without debt to the past and without hasty borrowing from the future. And, as he turned on the coffee maker, watching the first drops fall, he knew that the end of this story needed to honor what had set it in motion, the certainty that exchanging true love for a shortcut is tearing apart an entire life, and that rebuilding requires firm and gentle choices, made with the same hand. Winter began to slowly bid farewell, giving way to longer days and a different brightness, the kind that changes the texture of even the most worn sidewalks. Daniel, sitting on the kitchen bench, watched the steam rise from his coffee cup and realized that something in him was also settling. It wasn't the end of a process, but the beginning of a phase in which the past no longer had the power to dictate the rhythm of his mornings. Day after day, he had built a life that breathed on its own, where each commitment was chosen, not inherited. Around him, small details proved this: the plants in the windowsill that he watered himself, the new books mixed with the old, the notes Clara discreetly left and which he kept not as relics, but as living reminders of an active present. And in this present, there was room for lightness, for weightless plans, and for dialogues that needed no translation. Clara, in turn, had become a natural part of this routine, without invading or erasing what had already existed. She had learned his silences, understood his pauses, and, most importantly, respected each one. She never tried to compete with memories or forcefully occupy spaces, and perhaps that was why she had achieved a solid place. They walked side by side, unhurriedly defining labels, but with the certainty that they were building something healthy. One Sunday, sitting in the park, Clara mentioned that she liked how they could be together without having to prove anything to anyone. Daniel agreed, saying he had learned that love is not about replacing, but about adding, and in that adding, he finally felt whole. Laura, distant, was also following her own path, but hers was less easy. Moving to a new region brought new challenges and, along with them, the loneliness of starting over without the support of deep bonds. She tried for a while to fill the void with new connections, but realized nothing was building with the same consistency as before. The friends she had left were superficial, co-workers who limited themselves to occasional conversations and formal invitations. There were nights when she stared at the ceiling and mentally relived her conversations with Daniel, especially the last one, at the cafe, where she heard the forgiveness that felt more like a liberation from him than a relief to her. As the months passed, this forgiveness became a painful memory, because it symbolized not only the end of the relationship, but the realization that he had found a better path, and without her. Fate, however, seemed determined to cross their paths for the last time. A conference in the city where Daniel lived brought Laura back, albeit for a few days. At the end of the event, walking through the illuminated streets, she saw him from afar, sitting with Clara at an outdoor table in a small restaurant, laughing with a kind of freedom Laura no longer recognized in herself. There was no exaggerated touching or calculated displays, just the genuine intimacy of someone who understands each other with a look. Laura hesitated, considered crossing the street, but realized there was nothing more to say that hadn't already been said. She watched for a few seconds, then walked away, carrying with her the certainty that that chapter was definitively closed. The lack of contact, in that moment, was the greatest sign of respect she could offer. Daniel, unaware of this silent presence, continued his evening with Clara, discussing an idea for the next reading circle he would lead. They planned to take the young people to the park to write about what they saw and heard, demonstrating that inspiration comes not only from books, but also from everyday life. Clara suggested they bring coffee and bread, transforming the meeting into a moment of sharing. The enthusiasm for something so simple made Daniel realize he had finally found a kind of partnership that wasn't based on reservations or expectations, but on a mutual desire to grow together. On the day of the meeting with the young people, the sky was clear, and the grass still held the freshness of the early morning. Daniel arrived early, arranged the makeshift chairs, and once everyone was settled, he asked them to observe their surroundings and write about anything that caught their attention. It didn't matter if it was a detail or a grand scene, the important thing was to put their feelings into words. As they wrote, Clara circulated discreetly, serving coffee and smiling at each one. At the end, some read their texts, and Daniel realized that, like him, these young people were learning to look at life more carefully, recognizing the value of the little things. The feeling of having helped build this filled him with a quiet and lasting satisfaction. The cycle for everyone involved had closed in different ways. For Laura, the lesson came with the weight of loss and the clarity that choices have irreversible consequences. For Clara, the reward was finding someone willing to live in the present, without carrying around leftovers that didn't belong to them. And for Daniel, the lesson was understanding that true love isn't measured by how long it lasts, but by how it transforms, and that when trust is broken, rebuilding is possible, but not always with the same pieces. When he got home that night, Daniel put some water on to boil, opened the window, and let the fresh air flood the room. He looked at the mug with the small chip he'd saved and realized it no longer symbolized pain, but rather proof that some scars don't need to be hidden for something to remain useful and beautiful. He smiled, picked up his phone, and texted Clara, "Thank you for being here, not just today, but every day." He received a simple reply, "I like where we are," and knew that was all he needed to hear. And so, Daniel's story emerged not as a tale of revenge or reconquest, but as a testament to the fact that it is possible to transform pain into growth, as long as one has the courage to close doors and walk through new ones. Laura moved on, bearing the weight of her choices, and Daniel found in honesty and lightness the foundation for something new and true. Life doesn't restore what is lost, but it can offer other forms of happiness to those who choose to walk with integrity. If you've made it this far, please comment on what you thought of this story and which part resonated most with you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more impactful stories like this one. Let this narrative serve as a reflection. Betrayal not only destroys relationships, but erodes trust, shatters families, and erases stories that could have lasted a lifetime. It's never worth exchanging true love for a moment of illusion. And remember, this channel does not condone, in any way, any kind of betrayal.